Let me greet all of us this morning and indicate that I had said to Joe a few minutes ago, let him get ready to release the GDP because there was a roadblock that had to do with a crime scene, and not even the statistician general can pass those places, so we had to slow down a bit. But otherwise, let me greet members of the media, staff members of Stats SA, members of the public. I've been following news commentaries. The Mail and Guardian was, as way back as 20 hours ago, was raising issues of how the economy will look like in the fourth quarter. And the business day was also raising issues. So let us see. We are going to talk about the fourth quarter of the economy, and of course, after that, we're going to conclude with the annual numbers. And as we know that we always start with the production side, and we want to talk about how the economy has performed. The economy expanded by 0.1% as of the fourth quarter of 2023. And indeed, the year-on-year is 1.2%. When we look at where we have performed or how we have performed for the year 2023, it's sitting at 0.6%. We will come back to this issue of the 0.6% later. But let us look at the previous quarter and the revisions and the movements. We are saying that those that went up were general government services, finance, manufacturing, electricity, gas and water, as well as personal services and mining and quarry. Those that went down were trade, transport, construction, and agriculture. And of course, in the end, there was no change in terms of what we had indicated as of the third quarter, that the economy had contracted by 0.2%. Having said so, let us look at the real economy. We are saying that as of the fourth quarter, our economy was sitting at 1.158 trillion. And indeed, we can see that at some stage, in the third quarter of 2022, it had gone slightly higher at 1.161 trillion, but now slightly lower. It has been moving sideways from that third quarter of 2022. Now, let us look at the time series. We are saying that, and we have always brought this slide, we are saying that the economy has been moving sideways, but particularly after COVID, we can see that it's only 4 times that it contracted. It's on the lower part where we are amplifying that part so that we are able to see better what has happened post-COVID. And indeed, on the right-hand side, as of now, we are saying that the economy grew by 0.1%. I saw one article, Joe Boga, that was saying that we have dodged or avoided a recession. And I'm saying our job is to measure, is not to bring recession or to ease out recession. Our job is to measure. Let us proceed and say, in terms of industries, we can see that the industry that performed the most was transport, having performed at 0.2 of a percentage point, followed by mining and quarry, as well as personal services and finance that contributed 0.1 of a percentage point. But those that had a drawdown in the most were trade at negative 0.3 percentage points of a percentage point, and followed by agriculture at negative 0.2 of a percentage point. And indeed, we can see that it's just a coincidence that transport happens to have grown the strongest and indeed contributed the most. But there are times when the growth, the 2.9 that we are seeing of growth, sometimes that growth is not correspondent to the contribution that such a sector has made. Now, we want to make comparisons, and it's the first time we bring these kinds of comparisons to be able to demonstrate that what happened in the third quarter on the left-hand side and what sustains as we report on the fourth quarter. We can see, for example, that in the area of trade, we can see that perhaps right up there with agriculture, it's a second quarter. From the third quarter, it had indicated a negative growth. It continues to show a negative growth. And of course, we can see that construction shows the same, trade shows the same. But there are those that have moved sideways. And indeed, when we look at the sectors, we are saying that the primary sector is the one that contracted by 2%, whereas the secondary and tertiary sector retained a growth of 0.2%. Let us look at the primary sector. We are saying that the decline in agriculture, 9.7%, was largely due to field crops, horticulture products, as well as animal products. I was saying to the colleagues that have brought me this slide that this part I almost know it by heart, because when you have an increase, it's usually due to horticulture, field crops, and animal products. If you have a drop down, it's also due to those. Now, let us look at mining, which went up 2.4%. It was due to an increased production that was reported in the platinum group metals, as well as chrome ore, coal, and diamonds. Let us look at the secondary sector. What has happened in manufacturing? Up 0.2%. And we are saying that this was due to the contribution that came positively from transport equipment, food, beverages, and tobacco, wood, paper, publishing and printing, as well as furniture and other manufacturing. Electricity, that is utilities as in electricity, gas, and water, went up due to an increase in economic activity that was driven by production and consumption of electricity. And of course, construction went down due to a decrease that was reported in residential buildings and construction works. Let us look at the tertiary sector. The tertiary sector, we are saying that trade went down due to a decreased economic activity that was reported in all trade activities. Transport, we went up due to economic activity reported in all transport services. We went up in finance due to an increase in activities in financial intermediation, auxiliary services, real estate, and business services. Government, there was a decline in employment numbers in the civil service. And there was a comment that it also includes us. I won't mention who made that comment amongst the colleagues that are here and the colleagues that are seated here. But of course, let us look at personal services. There was an increase in economic activity that was reported in health and education. Now, let us look at nominal GDP, estimated at 1.801 trillion. And of course, the movements were in mining, that was up by 18 billion, all the way to 125 billion. Trade was up by 9 billion, all the way to 231 billion. Utilities were down 9 billion, all the way to 52 billion. And indeed, agriculture was down 18 billion, all the way to 20 billion. It's just a coincidence that the movements up and the movements down were by 18 and 9 billion. But it's easy for me. When they want me to remember, I will always remember the 9 billion and the 18 billion, but it's just a coincidence. Let us look at the structure of our economy. We are saying that finance continues to claim the stake at 24%, personal services at 16%, manufacturing at 15%, trade at 14%, government at 9%, transport 8%, mining 8%, and we are saying that utilities 3%, construction 2%, agriculture 1%. Of interest is manufacturing, which had been sitting at position 4 We will remember in 1994, manufacturing was the lead industry. It started to decline all the way to position 4, but it's starting to come across beyond trade now. Expenditure on GDP, we are saying that as of the fourth quarter 2023, our economy expanded, expenditure on GDP expanded by 0.1% and year-on-year 1.3%. And of course, the annual estimate is sitting at 0.7%. What are the movements in terms of the revisions? Those that went up were government final consumption expenditure, household expenditure. There were no changes in exports, and yet down it was in imports and in investments. And of course, that returned no change in terms of the movements of the revisions. In terms of the time series, we can see that since COVID-19, we have gone on a slump 3 times if we look at the bottom. And indeed, when we look at the right-hand side, that return is 0.1%. Now, let us look at the components. We are saying that imports, while they grew at 4%, they returned a negative contribution of 1.2 percentage points. And of course, we can see government services, a contribution of negative 0.1 of a percentage point, and indeed investments sitting at negative 0. Joe says that there is nothing like sitting on the line. So we always look at how their growth was, and of course it will tell us where their contribution is. That is why it's in 0. But those that contributed in the positive were exports, 0.2 of a percentage point, followed by household consumption at 0.1 of a percentage point in terms of contributions on the right-hand side. Now, let us compare the growth rates. We can see coming out of the third quarter all the way to the fourth quarter that in terms of particularly investments that have sustained a negative growth from the third quarter all the way to the fourth quarter, the others have actually interchanged and moved sideways. Now, households, in terms of household expenditure, we are saying that the growth was 0.2%, and indeed we can see the time series that shows that the previous 2 quarters other than the fourth quarter were in the negative. And going forward, we are saying where were the contributions of on that 0.2%? We are saying that the largest contribution came from miscellaneous goods and services at 0.4 percentage point, followed by communication at 0.1 of a percentage point, as well as transport at 0.1 of a percentage point. And indeed, those that went down in the negative, the most came from housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels. Now, we are also comparing in terms of the household consumption, and we are saying that we can see that largely those that have sustained a negative all the way include, amongst other things, alcoholic beverages, that we can see was red in the third quarter, continues to be red in the fourth quarter, and we can see that housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels have shown the same. But right at the bottom, miscellaneous goods and services were in the negative and have returned a positive uptake in the fourth quarter. Now, let us look at durability. In terms of durability, we are saying expenditure on durable goods increased by 2.1%. And of course, the biggest contribution came from services at 0.3 of a percentage point, whereas in terms of durable goods contributed a percentage point, 0.1 of a percentage point less at 0.2 of a percentage point in terms of contribution. And of course, those that went in the negative, the biggest drawback came from non-durable goods in terms of contribution, negative 0.3 of a percentage point. Now, we want to look again in terms of those movements. we can see that there were sideways movements in terms of being in the negative in the third quarter for durable goods, whereas in the fourth quarter they went positive 2.1. We see the same with semi-durable. They were positive, they went negative. But those that sustained the negative were non-durable goods, having returned a negative growth in the third quarter, and of course, a negative growth this time, and of course, that is inherent with the contributions that they've made. Now, government final consumption expenditure went in the negative 0.3%, and of course, we can see that in 2023, it was the first time in the fourth quarter that government final consumption expenditure had gone down. Otherwise, it had sustained a positive growth. And in terms of investments, we are saying that investments have gone down or have contracted by 0.2%. And indeed, this is the second quarter in a row that they have contracted, previously having reported a contraction of 3.8%, and indeed this one 0.2%. Now we want to see in terms of what were the main drivers. In terms of the main drivers, we can see that mainly this was driven by or driven lower by residential buildings. And indeed, if we look at residential buildings, we can see that their contribution was far much in the negative, 0.5 of a percentage point in that negative. And of course, that was followed by transport, followed by construction works, as well as machinery, construction works and machinery. And of course, if we compare in terms of the third quarter and the fourth quarter, we can see that other assets at the bottom was in the negative, it went positive. Transfer costs were in the positive, went negative. The one that showed non-residential buildings were in the negative in the third quarter, they went in the positive. The others sustained a negative growth, and indeed with their inherent negative contribution. And of course, we are saying that changes in inventories were 7.5 billion rands. Having said so, we can see that in the third quarter, changes were in the negative 39.7 billion, now up 7.5 billion. Let us look at exports and imports, and we are saying that both of them went on a positive growth, exports having recorded 0.6%, whereas imports recorded 4%. And indeed, we can look at the time series of exports, and we'll look at imports very soon. And we can readily see that on the right-hand side, exports have been staking their positive growth, sitting at 0.6%. And of course, they were largely, in the fourth quarter, were largely driven by an increase in prepared foodstuffs, beverages, and tobacco, as well as vegetable products, chemical products, and of course, base metal and other article-based metals. Bokang, next time, just increase the eyesight. I think I'm closer to retirement. And of course, as I move towards retirement, on this desk, I won't be alone. Joe and I are inching closer together. So for members of the media, those who sit here are the ones that will succeed us in the future, in case you don't know. Let's proceed. We are saying that imports in terms of time series went in the negative in the third quarter, 8.7%, up in the fourth quarter, 4%, and indeed they were driven largely by increased trade in mineral products, chemical products, and of course, vegetable products. Now, we are going to annual numbers. We have already touched on the annual growths, but let us look, we'll also look at industries. And of course, in terms of the performance of the economy as of the year 2023, we are saying that our economy performed at 0.6%. And the industries that contributed the most are largely coming out of finance, finance having contributed 0.4 of a percentage point, followed by transport and personal services that contributed 0.3 of a percentage point each. Those that went on a drawback or drawdown, the strongest drawdown in terms of contribution came from agriculture, having went down with contribution negative 0.4 of a percentage point. And when we make comparisons, we can see coming out of the top that in the previous year, 2022, agriculture had grown 0.9%, and of course, its contribution was sitting at 0. And of course, if we look, it has gone down negative 12.2% in terms of growth, but of course, contribution negative 0.4 of a percentage point. We can see that in terms of sustaining the negative contribution, it also came from utilities, as in electricity, gas, and water. But those that went in the positive, especially the biggest contribution, we can see that the biggest contribution as of 2023, 0.4 of a percentage point came from finance, which was previously 0.8 of a percentage point. And of course, it was followed by 0.3 of a percentage point coming out of transport, which had now returned a contribution of 0.6 of a percentage point. Expenditure on GDP also grew in the year 2023 by 0.7%. And of course, we can see that all components as of 2023 recorded a growth. Of course, the contribution that went in the negative came from imports, 1.2 percentage points. And indeed, we want to compare 2022 and 2023. We can see that all components showed a positive growth, and indeed with their contribution. Recap, we can see that our movements in terms of the production side and expenditure on GDP are congruent, and indeed our economy grew by 0.1% in the fourth quarter of 2023, returning an annual growth rate of 0.6%.